Hello, good evening, everyone. I'll step a little aside from this mic. It is my great honor to introduce Lynn Rainville, and I will read a little bit from her website about her. She's an author, speaker, and public historian who studies extraordinary Virginians doing extraordinary things in the past. After earning a PhD in Near Eastern archaeology, she spent 2 decades studying historic cemeteries, gravestones, enslaved communities, and their descendants, town poor farms, and Virginia's role in World War I. Today, she tells exceptional stories of exceptional Virginians whose names never made it to the history books, using archaeological, ethnographic, and historical sources. She uncovers lost sites and forgotten heroes from hometowns across the state. And she began this research in 1990, looking at American graveyards. She has done work in Turkey and has been here at Sweet Briar College for a number of years before venturing to become the inaugural Director of Institutional History at Washington and Lee University in 2019. One of the things that I find very remarkable about Lynn Rainville, having worked with her, is how much she drills down deep into local history. So without further ado, I'll present her to kick off our Founders Day events today. Thank you. Please welcome her warmly.
So there's nothing quite like giving a talk in the middle of a global pandemic with all of the other issues that are besetting us with ongoing systemic racism and a rainy night and everyone socially distanced in front of me, but also people live streaming. And as you can already see, while I desperately need glasses, I have yet to find a mask that works with them. So on top of everything else, I will be giving this and unable to see any of you at this point. But I hope that some of the stories that I have to share can make up for all of these different contingencies that we find ourselves in. So first, I'm delighted to be back on campus. I first came on this campus in 2001, and as one of the students in Professor Wah's class reminded me, that was the year she was born. And in a very polite way, she noted that that means that I have been working on research here into Black history at Sweet Briar for as long as she's been alive, with a subtle point of, just how long was it going to take me to do this research. So I kind of want to start, normally as a historian and a storyteller, I start with a premise, and then we don't get to the conclusion until the end. But I want to flip that and start with the conclusion, which is that you can't understand American history, let alone Sweet Briar history, without talking about African Americans. And here, also Native Americans. We are just miles away from the ancestral homeland of the Monacans, and although the enslaved Monacans here were a smaller percentage of that enslaved community, they were still present, and their descendants, just like the descendants of the enslaved African Americans, were also still working here through the 20th century and into the present. So 2 groups that have been, if not forgotten, certainly overlooked in some of the traditional histories that are completely critical to understanding the growth of the plantations here, multiple plantations, including the ones before Elijah Fletcher arrived, and the construction of the college and its associated buildings, and of course, the institution that survives to this day. And in picking the name for this evening's talk on Roots and Remembrance, the roots part was very much a multiple metaphor to the roots connected with genealogy, which is critical to putting together the histories and the contributions of these Black and Native families. It's also, of course, a reference to being grounded somewhere, to having a sense of place. And for me, the only way to have a sense of place is to understand the local history of wherever you are, whether you're working, you're at school, it's where you're from. And that's what led me back in 2001 when I arrived here. Initially, I arrived here for 1 year, part-time, teaching some anthropology classes. I had just finished my PhD in Near Eastern archaeology, so obviously very far afield topically, but I was immediately drawn when I arrived on this campus to the historic architecture, the archaeological sites, and the stories of the people who had come here before. And of course, it didn't take long, even though at that point I was really quite ignorant about Southern history, but it did not take long to recognize the cabin for enslaved families that still stands, that dates back to the 1840s, President's House, which was originally the center, the big house of the plantation, and a cemetery for enslaved families that had, right before I arrived, had gone through a period of decades of being overlooked and forgotten. And in fact, the only people who had been regularly traversing that site were members of the equestrian team, and without knowing that the uninscribed stones were actually marking the bodies of enslaved individuals, the site had not been properly cared for or even recognized. And one of the first first rituals that I was involved in was partnering with the then Dean of Students, Valerie Walker, who herself, she was an African-American woman and from Nelson County, and she and I partnered together in a very informal combination of oral history, and we were looking for descendants. We were trying to figure out how to more properly recognize that sacred site, but we didn't know where to begin. None of the stones, if you have had a chance, or when the rain passes, when you do get a chance to return to that sacred site, you will notice that none of the stones contain names or dates. This, by the way, is very common in historic African American cemeteries in Virginia in parts of the antebellum period, in part because in 1831, after the Nat Turner Rebellion, a series of laws were passed that made it illegal to teach enslaved individuals to read and write. Now, this didn't mean that people didn't use their own agency and in secret, at great potential personal risk, that they learned how to read and write, but it did make it less likely that they would then be inscribing the gravestones as a testament to basically breaking the law, that someone from the living clearly knew how it was literate. So at that site here at Sweet Briar, you have roughly 60 people buried in an oval, in really two sections, most likely connected to two different generations of families. And we re-recognized that site back in the early 2000s, and in our attempt to locate descendants, we started with an approach that normally would only maybe work half the time, and that was to look for enslaved individuals who, after emancipation, took the surname of the enslaver, in other words, the name Fletcher. And really, in a remarkable series of circumstances, after cold calling a number of Fletchers, mostly white Fletchers, we reached the Reverend Jasper or Eddie Fletcher, who is one of the descendants of the 155 people who were enslaved here on the eve of the Civil War. But one of the things I want to emphasize is, so the Fletcher family, Reverend Fletcher, and then his thousands of descendants in the present, they are descended from two people, well, actually one person who we know was enslaved here, and most likely her husband was as well, and that's James and Lavinia Fletcher. They were born in the early 19th century and began their family together in the 1830s. So those are two of the 155 people. So the Fletcher family, who have been extremely proactive over the last 15 years, have come to this site multiple times, have held their family reunion here. Several members of the family of roughly my generation have actively conducted research and added to our understanding of their family's history and their contributions over the generations. There are so many more stories and so many more contributions. And that was part of what I was trying to explore in the book that I wrote about the enslaved community and their descendants, the one that was called Invisible Founders, to recognize all of these different stories. And I was reminded coming back onto campus tonight, in part by the student's comment about how long I've been working on this. That is roughly, when we talk about generations in genealogy, there's no one set rule, but roughly a generation is 18 to 25 years. So in other words, I've been doing this research for a generation worth. And even though I'm a historian, I don't, of course, normally think of myself as part of history. I'm studying, frankly, far more interesting people from the distant past. So in putting together those pieces and coming onto campus tonight and thinking of who we've lost over this last generation in terms of African Americans who worked here, lived here, and then have passed away, one of the individuals I'm thinking of is Dorothy Sales. And all of you know at least some part of Dorothy's story because the Sales Education Building is named in her honor. She had worked here for half a century in a variety of capacities, and Dorothy was one of the individuals who was born in the cabin behind the president's house. Now Dorothy, she's 2 generations away from an enslaved family, so she was born instead in the Jim Crow era here in Virginia, and her father was Sterling Jones, so Sales is her married name, and she was one of, well, Sterling Jones had over 15 children with different wives, and she was one of those children who then stayed here and contributed to the college for, again, almost half a century. And when I arrived here in '01, she was still alive, and she was one of the very first people I interviewed on an old-fashioned cassette tape with a handheld microphone, and I remember going out to her house, and she had a clock in the background that was constantly dinging, and it was very distracting. And I somewhat recently re-listened to part of that tape, and I was both astounded at my own ignorance at that moment about deeper Sweet Briar history, but also at the richness of what she had to share. And although I interviewed her that one time, it always makes one wish that these people were still with us and that we could continue to learn from them. And there's a second individual to mention who has also unfortunately passed on, and that's Shirley Reed. She worked in the interlibrary loan office of the library and had worked her way up through various positions in the library, also had worked here for decades. And I can still remember the day when I put together some of her genealogy and realized she was the granddaughter of individuals who had been enslaved. So not a far distant, not 5 generations away, these were people that she knew as a small child, and they had both been enslaved. And imagining the stories that they had, some of which were passed down to her. And Shirley herself had done a lot of research and had traced the stories of her great-grandparents to the Fletcher Plantation and slavery right on this spot. Those were 2 people I was fortunate enough to know. And then there are the stories of people that we should certainly all know, or to put it a different way, anytime we're talking about Daisy, there are always African Americans that are part of that story, that are integral part of Daisy's story that should also be discussed. So for example, Martha Penn Taylor. Taylor is her married name. Martha Penn was enslaved by a family, the Penn family, a large local family. And Martha wrote one of the most both tragic and compelling documents that I had come across in my research. In 1854, she wrote a letter, again, thereby technically breaking the law, but writing a letter to Elijah Fletcher. And in it, she asks him to purchase her. And the reason why she does that is because he owned her sister. And Martha's owner was about to go to the Deep South, thereby one of the many tragic sides to slavery separating the sisters. And so Martha proactively took it upon herself to write this letter, come up with a plan, then the courage to write the letter, but thereby breaking the law in terms of showing literacy, and asked Elijah Fletcher to buy her. He did, thereby reuniting the sisters, at least temporarily, because I actually think, unfortunately, her sister died soon thereafter, because she's no longer in the records. And then after the war, she married a man, Henry Taylor, who had also been enslaved here, who was an iron worker, was very skilled with iron. And in fact, as I've come to learn more and more, I'm now working over in Lexington, just on the other side of the mountains, and there were a lot of iron forges in Lexington, and several of the talented African-American men in Amherst who were iron workers were being hired. Their skills were in such demand that they were being hired by white enslavers who owned iron forges in Lexington and being forced to travel over there, often for a year at a time, again, separated from their families, in order to produce the iron for necessary building projects. So Martha Penn Taylor, after the end of the Civil War, she remained here in Amherst. She lived in Coolwell, just down the road a little bit, and she was hired by Indiana Fletcher Williams as the nursemaid for Daisy. So Martha was caring for Daisy. Now, I should explain here that Daisy was a very cosmopolitan child. She spent half of her year in New York City, where she was in school, and then in the summers, she was sent here to her family's postbellum plantation. And if you read carefully the letters to and from Indiana, you will start to realize that Indiana herself, after the war, very much enjoyed being in New York City. And so while she continued to return here, she did not always come with Daisy. So in other words, Martha was sometimes basically single-handedly raising Daisy during parts of the summer until Indiana could come and join the rest of her family. So Martha played this critical role, and unfortunately, after Daisy's untimely death, as you can probably imagine, Indiana had a hard time being around anyone who reminded her of her deceased daughter. So Martha ended up kind of prematurely retiring and living in Coolwell. But for example, if you read through Daisy's diaries, and we have 2 years worth of them, you will see continual references to Martha, and that Martha is Martha Penn Taylor, an enslaved woman who, again, had the agency to redirect her life, even under very difficult circumstances. One of the last individuals I want to share with you is perhaps one of the most interesting and mysterious, and that's another person connected to Daisy, but not always included in the storyline, and that's Signora Hollins. She and Daisy were 1 or 2 years apart, so basically contemporaries. For a complicated set of reasons, Signora was here with her aunt. Her aunt was the cook here after the war, and so Signora was here and was one of Daisy's playmates. And again, once Daisy died, Signora was sent away because now there was the reminder of a child almost exactly Daisy's age who was alive and well when Indiana's own daughter had died. But Signora, she was sent up to the north to work for a while, and she returned to work for the college after it was founded. And so if we think about this in context, Signora, by the time she returns, and then she continues to work for the college for over 4 decades, Signora, in the early 20th century here, is one of the only people left who would have known Indiana, Daisy, Indiana's husband, Henry Williams. She knew all of the Fletchers, and at that point, all of the Fletchers, the white Fletchers, are dead. Miss Signora, therefore, is left as one of the main storytellers, one of the few people who had first-person stories to tell. And here's where it gets interesting. Signora was imbued with some special talents that, let's just say a couple centuries earlier, she probably would have been burned as a witch. But fortunately, by the 20th century, she was considered eccentric, but she had multiple stories about seeing the ghost of Miss Indy walking around Sweet Briar House, talking with her. And we have really an amazing recording of Signora right before she died, being interviewed by two faculty members. And unfortunately, the quality of the recording is really bad. But in it, she very straightforwardly, the men are asking, it's clear that the men are a little bit incredulous, and so they're asking her about, oh, so you say you sometimes talk with Miss Indy, which was Indiana Williams' nickname, and Miss Sig, which was her nickname, straightforwardly said, well, yes, sometimes I see her when I'm coming around the house, and one time she told me where she had silver buried, and she had all these, Miss Sig had all these stories about the 19th century here. And such an interesting life that she lived. And in fact, she died in the 1950s. And when I was starting to do oral histories with people like Dorothy Sayles or Shirley Reed, honestly, I wasn't really asking about Signora Hollins because she had died half a century before. And it was actually a colleague of mine, Crystal Rawson, who is the great-granddaughter of Sterling Jones, who started asking some deeper questions. And sure enough, even though most people alive today never knew, they were born after Miss Sig died, her presence was so strong that people in Coolwell still remember her and still have stories to tell about her. Including stories that involve snakes. So again, some of it gets a little bit unusual. But these are some of these strong characters. And by the way, they're not all women, although of course many of them are. But black men and women who have always been an integral part of the history here and part of what the institution has come to be, and the stories connected with people. It's part of what I was trying to share in the book to capture some of these stories. And perhaps one of the other most important things I can say here, other than Black history is everywhere around us. It's not siloed. It's part of understanding who we are and how we got here. But in addition to all that, even though I wrote a book and did a lot of interviews and wrote articles over the years, it's still the tip of the iceberg. There is so much more here that's important and so many more questions to ask and stories to tell about Black and Native history, even just here. Let alone Amherst itself. Amherst County, there are all sorts of interesting stories connected with Amherst County and the intersection with American history. But even refocusing to here, a plantation that was transformed into a college, that there's many more people to talk with and studies to do, and I hope in part through classes like Professor Waugh's History Detectives, that whether or not your end goal, your end goal might be, to study Chinese history or ancient history or something far afield from Amherst. Part of the beauty of this small-scale learning environment is that each of you have an opportunity to do one-on-one research with your faculty members, with staff members, and with members of the community. So even if you're not a history major, maybe you're interested in journalism, oral history is just a fancy word for interviewing someone. There are so many skills that you can gain by just asking really a series of simple questions, which is, what is this place? Who lives here? Why do they live here? What is their background? What brought them here? What kept them here? Any of these questions, including the questions about the material culture, the artifacts, the features, the buildings here on this campus, they all have stories to tell. In fact, just before I walked in here, someone reminded me of a question I had posed several years ago. I gave a talk at commencement, and I had pictures, and one of the questions I posed was a challenge for people, in part, to dissect more of these layers of the history that's surrounding us. And one of the questions was trying to find Daisy's original headstone. So in other words, the stone where you place the daisies up on Monument Hill, that's actually her footstone. And her original headstone was vandalized in the 19th century and then subsequently suffered some additional damage in the 20th. So it's been removed. It hasn't been on Monument Hill in decades. So it's somewhere else on campus. A little bit eroded and hard to read, but it's absolutely still here. And she reminded me that I had posed that question and that she had not yet found the stone. So I'm not going to break the tradition and tell you where it is tonight, but I will instead encourage all of you, whether it's visiting the cemetery for enslaved families and spending time at those stones, genuflecting on the lives, both the horrific aspects of life under slavery and then the power of their families that, in part in death, kept people together under unbelievably difficult circumstances, or whether it's walking back out to Monument Hill and studying the inscriptions, or the cabins for the enslaved families, or looking through our historic photograph collection in the library. It was one of the activities I did with Professor Waugh's class earlier today. The first 20 slides that I showed, all of them included African Americans here in the 20th century, doing every aspect of college building and landscape building that you can imagine. Our award-winning, the fact that our campus often gets voted as most beautiful in the country, none of this is obviously by accident. This is in part the hard work of African American employees ensuring that multiple thousands of acres are cared for and curated and therefore award-winning. So I'm coming up almost exactly on 30 minutes. I pretty much always welcome questions and normally always ask for questions at the end of the talk. I'm assuming that if I do that now, even without amplification, that I'd be able to hear questions from the audience. So, I'd love to give that a try, even though, again, I can't really see you, but I'm hoping that I can hear you. If anyone has any questions or aspects of this, this history is so rich and so complicated that obviously all I hope that I've been able to do here is encourage everyone to remain curious and keep asking questions about this history and learning more. Not that in any way it's comprehensive, but I'd be happy to take questions. Of course, I have to be able to see your hands are raised. Yes? Right. So what a good question. The question is whether or not I'm still studying this history. So the short answer is no, but the reason for that is in part because, right before I was hired by Washington Lee, I was actually starting work on two new books. One is on town poor farms, and one was an ethnography of ghost stories here in Virginia. But so the yes part to that answer is that, in part, the 19 years that I spent here studying this rich history will never leave my research question, it continues to inform my research questions, and then the only difference is now my last couple books, other than Invisible Founders, my other books on cemeteries and World War I, now usually my laboratory is the state of Virginia to broaden some of the types of stories that we can tell. I'm not, unfortunately, in 24 hours a day, actively able to continue to pursue research leads here. For example, the book on town poor farms, one of the other projects that I started on here back in roughly when some of the people in this room were born, was on the local poor farm here in Amherst. And it was actually part of that research. Poor farms are fascinating. For example, many of the poor farms in the 19th century were integrated, and they weren't integrated out of any particular, for maybe reasons that we would hope, because people realized that segregation was bad. They were integrated because in most of these poor farms, people were more concerned about men and women getting together and making more paupers than they were about race. And town poor farms are this just fascinating moment of, well, the shortest way to say this is, you would think by the name that a poor farm is where you send people who are poor, and it's like a, you know, a pre-Social Security or a New Deal moment. And instead, poor farms are a fascinating, people are put in poor farms who are considered socially undesirable. And so the interesting question is, well, who's considered socially undesirable in the 19th century? For example, women who have children out of wedlock are sometimes sent to the poor farm. And a lot of these questions came from my research into, you know, multiple generations of families living here and some of the, both the challenges and the successes that they had. Other questions? Yeah. Right. So that question from the president is about what more can we say and how can we quantify the number of Native peoples who were either enslaved here or who worked here afterwards, like Bowman Knuckles, who worked here in the 20th century as a gardener for decades and in part is responsible for some of the care of the landscaping in and around the president's house and other spots on campus. So, and again, the president is exactly correct. Part of the challenge with correctly and holistically identifying Native peoples is that in 1924, Walter Plecker, an unbelievably racist head of the Bureau of Vital Statistics, unilaterally decreed he only believed in two races. Basically, he believed in one race, and that was the white race. And for him, everyone else was non-white. And so what he did was he unilaterally, if people who are, and so for him, the categories were white, and in those days, the language he was using was Negro. So he didn't have a space for Indians, and he was unilaterally changing birth certificates of Native people. If Native peoples on the birth certificate identified as Indian, he would change that to Negro. This means, from a historian's perspective, it is very, like some of the sources that like, how do I ever know in the past if someone's black or white? I mean, if you have a photograph, that might tell you, you know, some of the story, but a lot of what you need to rely on are census records, or birth certificates, or death certificates. So in the case of Native peoples in Virginia, there is basically entire generations of data lost by this racist decision, and so it obscures Native descent. And then you're entirely correct that one of the ways I tried to get around that is I also visited nearby Native cemeteries, that plus talking with, of course, the Monacan tribe. There are a series of surnames that predominantly include people of Native descent, but then just like with other, in other communities, there's a lot of intermarriage. So it does get very complicated, especially because I would always want to represent people's ethnic identity in the way that they would identify, not just how I would see it as a historian. Again, in using like a census record or a birth, or normally when you use birth, marriage, and death certificates, you're using however those individuals identified. So including, for example, African Americans who were passing as white. Well, you're using how they wanted to be identified. But with Native peoples, with this artificial destruction of records, it means that I was not as comfortable quantifying, because that would put me in the position, in some cases, based on a surname, like Knuckles is very much a Monacan surname, or Branham, which is another Monacan surname, me being the arbiter of, well, that person not only has a Native surname, but identified as Native in the past. But having said that, I would add that one of the first stories I heard early on when I started this research, I was making a big effort to put information out on what was then still an incipient web. In other words, there wasn't Facebook, there wasn't social media, but I had websites and was sharing what I was working on in the hopes that I could reach descendants. And several people were calling me, good old-fashioned phone calls, and one of them was an individual they were Monacan, and they had a story of their grandfather who was 100% Monacan, and her memory of family histories was that he had been the overseer, the farm manager here in the 80s and 90s. And the story that had come through her family was that unfortunately, there wasn't a long story associated with this, but that her grandfather had rode this really large, like a stallion, and that he had been in charge of all of the lands. So it's both the power of oral history and then some of the limitations of tracking it down in the records. No, Bowman Knuckles, no, the person who was the overseer, he had a different surname, and so no, although the timing would have worked in terms of the generations, but no, Bowman Knuckles, that was a different family. And just like the African American families here on the eve of the Civil War, of the Native families, or of the families that identified that were enslaved, who were almost certainly of Native descent, it's about half a dozen different families. And so Bowman Knuckles is one of those families, but then there were several others. And if you haven't, well, certainly on COVID, it certainly isn't open, but as we get past all this, the Monacan tribe has a museum dedicated to their history that, again, is just a couple miles away from here, that pre-COVID was open several times a week. And in the past, some of your predecessors, we used to incorporate aspects of the artifacts in that museum into classes and use it as part of studying museum exhibits, tying in with the museum on campus. Any other questions? Yes? So, right, it's a good question on how to keep the cemetery for enslaved families, how to always keep it as part of the active landscape here in the landscape of memory, not just in the landscape of memory. And really, my main answer would be creating rituals around it. And it's not just because I'm an anthropologist that I say that, but there's always a challenge with anything historical that it can be a very passive, like reading about history is technically very passive. And to care about something in the present and to encourage other people to care about it, not to mention remember it, that's usually where rituals come in, which is one of the reasons why it's so powerful on Founders Day, that with a procession to Monument Hill, that there should always be a parallel procession to the cemetery for enslaved families. But it never has to stop there. There could be all sorts of moments. We don't know specific death dates of any one individual in the cemetery, but you can do this around the change in seasons. You can do it around other holidays in the year. Memorial Day. There are lots of different ways to do this. The other thing I would add that's more complicated in terms of the upkeep of the cemetery, obviously I don't know very much about this present moment, but I do know that about 10 years ago, students and members of the community had the exact same criticism. Why is it that the slave cemetery why isn't the lawn mowed? Why is it overgrown. And at that point, members, hourly workers in facilities volunteered. It was such a huge project. They ended up volunteering hundreds of hours, and there were dead trees, there were rodent holes, I mean, the whole 9 yards. And they cleaned it up. But unfortunately, in Virginia, none of that is sustainable unless it has to be done multiple times every year, no matter how much effort you put into it. And this brings me back to the idea of rituals, whether it's, a student group that helps with it, members of the community. Cemeteries are, large cemeteries, like the one here, in rural areas are always very hard to keep up with Mother Nature, who always wants to take it back. So I would say that the kind of, the cycle here would be with more rituals and more people visiting the site and helping to care for it along the way. And most likely, frankly, in the long run, it would help, whether it's mulch, whether it's, there are some things that could probably be done that would decrease how quickly it gets overgrown again by some different plantings, for example. But for me, really, rituals, because that's what makes this history come alive. That when people are, and just like what we would have done this evening if it hadn't been pouring, bringing flowers, genuflecting, remembering people as a community, very important. Any other questions? Well, I'll end it there with the plea in part that I began with, which is that Black history is American history, and just like I'm sure in all of your history classes here, if you're not asking about what African Americans did or how they contributed, that always has to be part of how you approach any part of history. And when you approach it here for the local history, there's still a lot to learn. My book and my research is still just the beginning, and I hope that some of you will take up that research challenge. Thank you very much.
I want to give thanks to Dr. Rainville for that wonderful talk. I think her message about being inclusive and thinking about a broader history is very important. And we want to also thank the audience that is watching tonight. We appreciate the kickoff of our Founders Day events. Please stay tuned for tomorrow's events as well. Thank you.